I want to talk about this idea of faiththeism, faith plus atheism. And I want to demonstrate, and I'm going to use Caputo quite a bit, but I want to demonstrate that both atheism and theism are two sides of a coin, so they're different, but they're two sides of the same kind of coin. And as I'm going to argue, it's an imperial currency. Okay, so when we talk about the atheists side of faitheists, the atheism side of faiththeism, what do we mean? What are we talking about? Atheism, like we hear the word atheist, right? And our minds immediately go to, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris. When we think of science, in this regard, we think of people like Neil deGrasse Tyson, right? And so we think of atheists in terms of these new atheists, right? These, what Caputo calls the big strong men of reason over against the big strong men of theology, right? These big strong men of reason are what we think of when we think of atheism. They have no patience for faith, the transcendence, anything smacking of religion. It's superstition, it's priestcraft. That's another Lutheran term, by the way, priestcraft. Interestingly, this is a side note, but one of my professors in seminary, I was in seminary in the early 2000s to the mid 2000s, right? And so that was when Harry Potter and the Harry Potter films and books were huge. And I remember one of my professors wrote an article talking about the fact that the Reformation sort of demystified Europe. Europe before the Reformation was filled with superstition and priestcraft, much like Hogwarts in the Harry Potter series is this castle where, prospective witches and wizards are trained in their witchcraft. And the Reformation, according to my professor, cured Europe of that superstition. And, it's sort of ironic, because, it's not, I don't think it's any, I've been saying for years that people like Richard Dawkins are just, basically Protestants without Jesus. And it's interesting that, who is it in the intellectual world today who denies free will? Well, Calvinists and scientific materialists, they're the ones who deny free will. So it's like Calvinism without the religion is what, these big, strong men of reason and science are all about. And I think personally, and Catholicism has sort of, not softened me, but sort of reinvigorated me with an appreciation for the wonder and the magic and the enchantment of the world, right? And so to me, the idea of Hogwarts without wizards or of Europe without magic is just kind of sad. I think it would make J.R.R. Tolkien cry if he were still with us, because that just sounds to me like replacing the enchantment upon the forest of Fangorn with Saruman's desire to cut those trees down and use them as fuel to fuel his wheels of industry and weapon making, right? It's that's a whole thing. Don't want to get too distracted here with that. But suffice it to say that this idea that we ought to disenchant Europe or the world, or Hogwarts for that matter, is not something I'm interested in at all. But what do we mean when we say atheism? What's the atheism part of faiththeism? Atheism with respect to what? We are atheists in regards to what, right? Well, as you will know if you've been following my work at all, this goes back, some form of my Exile empire paradigm has existed since I've been 18 years old, right? So like 10 years. I'm just kidding. I'm older than 28. But this Exile empire distinction that I've been talking about in this paradigm I've been trying to build with you all comes into play here in a very significant way. What do I mean? I have to define empire before I can define exile, because exile is a suspicion of empire. But if you don't know what I mean by empire, then you don't know what I mean by being suspicious of it, right? Empire is shorthand for what Caputo calls strong theology, okay? He juxtaposes, contrasts that with weak theology. And he is, excuse me, and he is just springboarding off of Paul's categories in 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, where he talks about the weakness of God is more powerful than the strength of men. The folly, the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men. And he's even springboarding to get to there from the cross, because he says, when I was with you in Corinth, determined to know nothing except Jesus Christ and him crucified. That's all I wanted to talk about. The cross, he says, was my central message. The only thing, everything else was subsumed under that. Everything else was under that rubric, that umbrella, right? That broad category, the cross. And what does Paul say about the cross? It is folly. The cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. It is a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Greeks, right? To the elite, to the status quo of the day, whether sacred or secular, the cross is absurd, foolishness, it is weakness at its zenith, right? And so Caputo takes those categories of weak and strong and extrapolates them, weak theology, strong theology, corresponding to my own nomenclature of exile and empire. What is empire? Empire is strong theology, imperial theology. We've talked a lot about this. Empire gives us the kind of theology that is dogmatic. It gives us the kind of scriptures that are canonical, okay? What do I mean by that? Well, when you hear someone say, and it doesn't matter who, it could be a liberal, feel-good Protestant church or a high church Anglican congregation or a Catholic priest. When you hear things like, certain doctrines are essential to the Christian faith, such as the Trinity and the deity of Christ, for example. You can't be a Christian without those. Whatever you call Christianity is not Christianity if it does not incorporate these two essential doctrines, or as Catholics call them, dogmas. The Trinity, the idea that there is one God who eternally subsists in three divine persons, the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. The Father is not the Son is not the Spirit is not the Father. They are all distinct. They're not separate, but they're distinct, but they all are the one God, okay? Or the idea that the deity of Christ, that Christ is the second person of the Godhead, of the Blessed Trinity, that he is the hypostatic union of the divine and human natures in one divine person, the Logos, who came into this world. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, John chapter 1 verse 14. The Trinity and deity of Christ are talked about by just about anybody as dogma, as essential, as things without which Christianity is not Christianity, right? As I said, empire furnishes us with scriptures that are canonical. What does that mean? Well, canon's just a Greek word. It's not like canon, like with three N's, like a cannon, you shoot a cannonball at somebody. Canon is with, in C-A-N-O-N, right? Means in Greek a measuring rod, right? A standard against which something is measured, right? So you hear this in all kinds of contexts. People in Star Wars universe, will talk about how, what is canon in this lore and what is not, right? Which of the various Star Wars films, offshoots, TV shows, standalone specials, comic books, graphic novels, what counts as canon and what is not? What is essential to the story and is non-negotiable, and what is take it or leave it, right? And that's what we apply to the New Testament. You go into any bookstore that has Bibles and you open up the table of contents, the New Testament, there's going to be 27 books. Why? Because that's the New Testament canon, right? These are the 27 books that the imperial church has declared with their... These are the 27 books that the imperial church has used its magisterial authority to declare to be canon. These are the books that comprise the New Testament. No fewer, no more. Okay? So even in a Protestant church that doesn't accept the authority of any magisterium that has the ability, the power to declare such a thing, because it's pretty audacious for somebody to declare for all of Christianity what is the New Testament and by extension what is not. No one gets to say, well, actually, I took a few books out and I added a few books in. Or I just took some books out, like Marcion did in the 3rd century, I think. No Christian just gets to say, well, my New Testament is the 27 books plus the purpose-driven life. Or I don't like the book of Hebrews, I took it out. Or Martin Luther wanted to take out the book of James because he's like, I don't see Christ in it, right? Well, the fact that our scriptures are spoken of as canonical is reminiscent of empire, right? This is the kind of imperial authority that strong theology exercises. These are the kinds of muscles that empire can flex. It can say, these are the doctrines essential to Christianity that you must believe, to use that label, and these are the scriptures that comprise our Bible, right? And case closed. Thus saith the Lord, right? Well, this is all example of empire, right? These are very imperial, strong kinds of claims. And exile, as I've said, is not an alternative strong theology. Okay? Exile doesn't look at the dogmatic proclamations or scriptural canonical proclamations of the imperial church and say, we disagree, and here's our replacement for those dogmas, and here's our replacement for those scriptures. Because that would just be another version of empire, right? That would just be a lateral move from strongly grasping on one set of ideas to just as strongly grasping on some alternative set of ideas. That's not what exile is. A lot of people, when they quote unquote, deconstruct, what they're really doing is they're just exchanging one idol for another, one set of ideas that they can fetishize and get all lathered up about for some other set of ideas, right? And so it's like going from being Mormon to being Jehovah's Witness. You think like, I guess, it's a lateral move, though, at best, but it's a lateral move in most cases when people deconstruct. It's like being addicted to alcohol and then, quitting that and becoming addicted to CrossFit, right? CrossFit's a better thing to be addicted to, I suppose, but it's still that same epistemological hubris and that same sort of rabid, grasping, clinging to whatever sacred object or whatever idol is floating your boat at the moment. Exile is not just a lateral move from believing in these ideas or scriptures to believing in those ones, but exile instead is a suspicion of empire. So it's not offering an alternative theology or an alternative Bible. There's no P.O. box or headquarters where you could send a letter to the exilic ecclesiastical, headquarters located somewhere, Nashville, D.C., Rome, whatever. No, exile is a posture. It is a posture of incredulity, okay? Jean-Francois Lyotard famously described postmodernism insofar as such a thing can be defined or described. He defined it as incredulity toward meta-narrative, which means a suspicion, a sideways glance, a discomfort with any big story. A meta-narrative is just an overarching story that subsumes local narratives within it. It could be capitalism, it could be socialism, it could be Christianity, right? It could be atheism. Postmodernism looks at meta-narratives and sort of looks askance, sideways, with a measure of incredulity and suspicion. That's what exile is toward empire. That is how exile looks at empire, right? And so exile and empire are distinct, but not as though they are two sides of the same coin. As I'm going to get into in a minute, exile's doing its own thing over there in the corner.